works.
This mic working okay? Yeah, sounds right. Good. All right, hello. Welcome to the first talk of PyCon 2018. I am beyond thrilled to be able to introduce Christopher Neugebauer, Josh Simmons, and Sam Kitajima-Kimbrel to talk about how we designed an inclusivity-first conference on a shoestring budget and short timeline. Please give them a round of applause.
Oh, we're on stage at PyCon. These working? Great. Hi, I'm Chris. I'm a serial conference organizer from Australia. And in March last year, I moved in with Josh, who lives in a town called Petaluma in Northern California. Here's a picture of that place. And 2 months later, I found myself at PyCon in Portland. And I was chatting with Andrew Godwin about how cool it would be to run a new conference in the town I just moved to. By the end of PyCon, Sam, Josh, Andrew, and I had decided that we were going to run that conference.
But we had some problems. First, we didn't have any money. Second, we didn't have a venue. And third, nobody knew we existed.
So, over the course of the next 6 months, we added Sarah from PyLady Silicon Valley to the team. We'd run a call for proposals, and we had found some sponsors.
And we put on a conference in a live music venue with a really cool marquee.
And actual speakers giving actual talks.
And, sorry.
And we built a community of people who actually showed up for our conference.
After the event, people told us that we'd run a great conference with lots of technical depth, with talks that people actually wanted to go to. But they also told us something else. We'd run a conference where people had noticed just how inclusive we were. Like, they really noticed this.
They noticed how we prioritized making a safe and welcoming environment for everyone.
Yes.
So we probably did okay?
Yeah, we did all right.
So this is the story of how we ran the first North Bay Python.
An inclusivity-first conference.
On a shoestring budget.
And a short timeline.
So, hello, I'm Josh. I handled communications and outreach for the North Bay Python team.
Hey, I'm Sam. I ran the program committee and selected the talks that went on stage.
And I'm Chris, and I built the budget for the conference and handled our sponsor relationships, and also figured out how to spend the money that we raised. So first, why are we here at PyCon presenting this talk to you all? This was our first year all running a conference together, but we got a lot of things right in the process. But a lot of experienced conference organizers don't do inclusivity or diversity activities well at all.
And while the leadership in the tech industry is predominantly white and male, it's our job to build spaces that gives people who aren't like us and are underrepresented in the community at least as much space as people who are like us. Our industry shouldn't be doing this poorly at inclusivity.
So what we're about to show you, we built from scratch with no money. New events that have more planning time than we did, or longer established events, should be able to do this as well. So today, we're going to share with you some of the most effective strategies we used to build that diverse and inclusive conference.
Josh.
All right, thank you. So how do you build an inclusive community? First, I'm going to dive into a little marketing jargon. Sorry, but not really, because marketing is super important to reaching the people you want to attend. First, we have the audience, which, as you might imagine, it is exactly the people that you're trying to reach who you want to be participating in your conference as speakers or attendees. We had a vision for North Bay Python of the audience that we wanted. And here are a few of the things that describe that audience. Important for us is that we wanted the attendees and the participants to roughly, or as best as possible, be representative of the demographics in the greater Bay Area that surrounds us. And then we have channel. Channel is the medium over which you reach people, and there are lots of them. So we ran, and we used about as many of them as we possibly could, given our limited bandwidth, short timeline. Definitely encourage people to use all of the channels, and not just the ones that you're very familiar with and see often. campaign. Campaign is a series of things that you promote, such as your CFP, your diversity and inclusion initiatives, sponsorship, ticket sales, and logistics. Now, I want to highlight that we treated diversity and inclusion as a top-level campaign. So while we gave it at least as much attention in our promotions as we did ticket sales, because we wanted people to know that these were things that we cared about. We wanted them to be welcome and feel included and supported at the event. Here's the most jargony of the jargon. We have a conversion funnel. And this is roughly what it looks like. First, somebody learns you exist, then they learn about you, then maybe they consider attending your event or becoming a part of your community. Then there's conversion. The act of converting is when they buy a ticket and they decide to show up. Then hopefully they actually show up to your event. They have an experience, ideally a good one, and then they come back. And if you're lucky and you've done a really good job, they will share it and encourage other people to come to the next one. Okay, that's it for Marketing 101. So these are the things that we focused on that were really critical to making sure that we had a diverse and inclusive audience and community for this new event and community that we were building. We started with our team, and while there are only 3 of us up here, you notice that we probably have a couple things in common. True of the other 2 organizers as well. We were all white. We may all be queer, but we are all cisgendered. We're people of privilege, basically. And so what we needed to do was pay attention to the things that our team doesn't have, because there's a lot of life experience, a lot of backgrounds that we don't understand. So what you need to do is recruit advisors and advocates. We found a parent. We found a person with mobility issues who is an accessibility advocate who could help us with those matters. We found people from the Latinx community and people of color to help us make sure that these are audiences that we were speaking to and serving properly. Prioritize your outreach. We had a short timeline, we had limited bandwidth, and the reality is that the most important outreach you're going to do to the people who are hard to reach and hard to convert is the most important. People like us have no problem deciding to come to a conference. We are basically the status quo. We know we'll feel reasonably comfortable at most conferences, and we have the resources to make that happen. But that's not true of everybody. And so if you want to change the status quo and have people who aren't like us at your event, you need to work for it. And because it's harder, you need to prioritize it. Now, by default, we market to people who are easy to reach and easy to convert, because it's the fastest way to short-term profit, to butts and seats. But we're not maximizing for profit in butts and seats. We want community health. Now, I'm not going to explain why we want community health, because you are here in this talk or you're watching this video, so I assume you're already on board with that. So the key to remember is that the usual suspects, white men, basically, they're going to show up at your event, whether you try to promote it to them or not. You don't have to work hard for that audience at all. Go to a meetup, put the word out there. They'll find out about it. So what we did is we focused the majority of our energy in terms of outreach and community building on groups like PyLadies, Women Who Code, Women Tech Makers. There were a number of groups that we focused our outreach on. This is also very important. You want to make a really, really good first impression. And that first impression is a great opportunity to not have a relationship with somebody by accidentally alienating them because you're using othering language or whatever it may be. So you want your first impression to be good. You want the copy on your website to be good, so when they're learning about you, they feel welcome and included. And you want to make sure the way you speak and do your announcements is also inclusive. Really cannot say this enough. this book, The Responsible Communication Style Guide, was super useful for us. Now, I've been in community building and marketing for most of my professional life, and so I have some practice with communicating with care. I have some experience doing outreach to groups representing underrepresented people. But still, I referred to this book like it was my Bible. There were multiple times that I went back to it, and I realized that I don't actually know how to communicate around people with disabilities or certain types of disabilities or people with different ethnic backgrounds. So yeah, that book, super useful. Definitely encourage you to check it out. The last thing that was really key for us is we hired a professional. Now, you may think you don't have a budget for it, and I'm not going to dive into budget because Chris is going to talk about that, but you probably do. We hired a professional, Sage Sharp, who is actually in the audience over there, with Otter Tech Consulting. Sage reviewed our code of conduct, reviewed our policies, helped us refine them to make them even better. Sage gave us enforcement trainings, because without an enforcement training or enforcement at all, a code of conduct is just a piece of paper. And then PyCon decided to hire Sage too. So maybe there's something to hiring professionals to consult on these matters. And then boom, just like magic, a community springs forth. You're done. So, to recap, we built an inclusive team, we prioritized the difficult outreach, and we communicated with care. And we hired a professional. Don't forget that one. But it's not magic, and you're not done. Even with the best and most inclusive marketing and community building efforts, you still have to actually run a conference. So here to talk about crafting a superlative and representative program is Sam.
Thanks. Okay, so I am here to tell you even more about expectations and how you're going to set those expectations for your community, mostly around what your program is going to actually involve, who's going to be on stage, and why people should come to your conference, because they should be confident that the people on stage look like them, have experiences similar to them, and can talk about things that they know about. I'm going to talk to you about how you're going to make your submission process as welcoming as possible to make people comfortable, because people don't submit talks to events that they're not comfortable with. And I'm going to talk about being deliberate in making your selection process as equitable as possible. So first, expectations. As Josh mentioned, we decided that we wanted to make the event roughly representative of underlying Bay Area demographics, so obviously that's at least half not men, and significant proportions of people who aren't white, people who are queer, and so on. You also need to define a margin of acceptability as to we're close enough to run with it for this year, and when do we need to go back to the drawing board. North Bay Python for 2017, we just about hit the mark for gender and orientation, and we need to do much, much better on race and ability and other dimensions for years to come. So again, you just need to know when you got close or if you need to go back and get some more people. You need to use that expectation setting language once you open your CFP. And along with that, in your CFP, you should tell people as much as you can. More is better, within limits, obviously. But I say this both as a speaker who has submitted to talks to, well, PyCon, and as a program chair who's been on the other side of this. You need to know what types of talks you want. Do you want beginner, advanced, probably both, something spanning the spectrum, overviews of a broad category of things, or deep dives into a particular technology or library? You want to provide lots of suggested topics, but make clear that that long list of suggested topics is not exhaustive or limiting. People can come up with stuff that's not on there. And you need to give your submitters or potential submitters lots of links to resources, because there are tons of them out there to help people learn how to brainstorm ideas, how to take those ideas, those rough ideas from brainstorms, and refine them and pick the one that's actually going to work, writing up the proposal, and how to get help with your proposal as you write it. This is also a really good place to put your code of conduct front and center, again, because everybody needs to know your code of conduct and adhere to it, but in particular, the people you're putting on stage in front of your 300-person audience need to know about your code of conduct and adhere to it. Speaking of the audience, people need to know who's in the audience. So as a speaker, they can hit the right difficulty level and make the right references so people actually come along with their content. And Chris is going to talk about money in a bit, but financial aid is particularly relevant to speakers. Just by asking people to submit a talk to you, you're asking them to do unpaid labor just to write that proposal up and send it to you. And it'll be easier for them to do that and make that commitment if they know that they won't be surprised by having to pay more out of their own pocket to come to your conference and do more labor and actually present that talk. Finally, you can make people comfortable by collaborating with them. You should be active throughout your entire submission period, right? Don't just put your CFP up there and then go silent for 6 weeks and then say, hey, we've got some talks. You should be engaged and available throughout the entire submissions period. First-time submitters in particular can really use help here. And what we did, we asked our reviewers and other people from the community who had experience to work one-on-one on a volunteer basis with submitters to refine their proposals and get them reviewed before we put them in front of the review committee. We had a structured and public venue for this. We had an email list, and we had an IRC channel with scheduled office hours every week where people could drop in and ask questions and get paired off with somebody to give them advice. Okay, and finally, you have to decide how you're going to select your talks. And you need to publish that method and have it be written down so that your community knows how you're going to pick things, and stick to it. I want to define here the difference between an equal outcome and an equitable outcome, right? Because an equal outcome can be done mechanically. Just pick exactly the same number of things from each bucket. But equitability, true equitability, requires consideration and deliberate effort to overcome the existing biases and systemic inequalities that would lead you away from that equitable outcome. So some things you can do that work towards that are working with your review panel. Josh spoke about how we sought out advisors to round out our limited perspectives as an organizing team. And one key place that their perspective was particularly helpful in was in reviewing the talks. We brought in about half a dozen people whose experiences and backgrounds differed from ours, and they were critical in making sure we had that representative range of content into our program because they saw things in the proposals that we didn't see. They understood the content in a way that we wouldn't. When they're doing that, you have to start with an anonymized round of review where everybody on your review panel reads and scores every proposal without seeing who it's from. This is really important as a proactive step to counter conscious and unconscious bias. And we gathered both a numeric score, it's just actually -2 to +2, so we could do some really quick statistics and sort things, but also as much qualitative written feedback as our reviewers were willing to provide on the talks. After that anonymized round, and we had a score from every reviewer for every talk that we could sort things on and add it up and do math, we kind of made a first cut of our submissions and figured out a line out of our pile of roughly 100 talks and said, here are things that we think should be given further consideration. And then we reattached the identities of the submitters to those talks to inform a curation from that first cut to build our final lineup of talks. And we met a couple times with our full panel of volunteer reviewers just to get input, because sometimes math doesn't actually give you the answer you want. We made sure people could advocate for talks that they thought had been judged poorly by this, just the round of voting. But after that, when we kind of gathered that feedback, that was really when you have to stop being hesitant and use your executive power as your program chair and the organizing team to make decisions and build a coherent, curated program. When you're doing this, you need that identity because the anonymized first pass told you which talks had good content and which things had good treatments of those topics. But now you need to be informed as to whether the submitters are good people to present those topics. And this is different from the right person because there can be multiple right people to present a talk depending on what you're looking for. And this really is your final opportunity in your selection process to actively work towards getting a balanced representation on stage. The lived experience of different presenters will result in different perspectives in talks, even on the same subject, and even, I would say, particularly on perennial conference topics, things that show up all the time. Give the unheard voices a chance. And then, finally, this is the part that hurts. Remember those expectations you set before you even opened your CFP? Once you have your potential list of speakers, you need to revisit them and make sure you measure up. If you meet your criteria, right, are you close enough? Or did you end up with a speaker list that consists entirely of the usual suspects? It's not the end of the world to extend your submissions period and do more outreach so you can throw a wider net out there and get more talks to make sure you have that truly inclusive and representative program. So to recap, building from that strong base of community and support that our outreach program established, that Josh was talking about, we were able to communicate a great deal to our submitters about our expectations around the program. We were able to engage with and actively support all of our submitters, particularly people who are coming to us with their first proposal ever. And we were able to design equitability into our selection process with the anonymized first round review, and then re-identifying things and giving people the chance to advocate for talks that might have been missed, and published that spec, basically, of how we were doing this, so our community knew what we were up to. Which got us from having a community to having a set of positively first-rate talks. Seriously, go watch the videos. I can't believe how good they are. That was drawn from, representative of, and relevant to our entire community's experiences and interests. This really sounds like a conference to me, I think. We have a venue? We have to pay for things?
Sorry.
Please help.
Okay. Thanks, Sam. Where did my slides go? That's strange. My slides have disappeared.
Oh.
I can fix this. I have my backup. So I'm going to talk about building inclusion into your budget. So in a perfect world, we would be running a conference, and everyone with even the slightest interest in Python would be able to attend and enjoy our event. But unfortunately, running a conference does indeed cost money. And in most cases, organizers pass that cost on to the people who attend. But not everyone who wants to attend your conference is going to have that money spare. That's people like students, people who are on low incomes, people who have families to support. These are the sorts of people who would really benefit from events like ours, but in many cases, these are exactly the sorts of people who can't afford to attend. So cost is an inclusivity issue for conferences. Also, unfortunately, most of the sorts of the programs that help people get to conferences also cost money. And that's a problem with us because we started in May last year with no money for running the conference in the bank. So I'm going to talk about how we funded our outreach programs on a shoestring budget. So speaking of budgets, we need to talk about those because it's how you decide how much money you have and what you can spend money on. Your conference budgets are usually made up of two things, floating costs and fixed costs. Floating costs are your costs that increase as you sell more tickets. They're costs that are inherently attached to bringing another person to your conference. And fixed costs are your costs that stay the same, regardless of how many people show up to your conference. So generally, your tickets and your sponsorship, your revenue should pay off your base costs, and then everything you have left is your margin. Your margin is the money that you can use to spend on other things. Things like financial aid, things like social events to welcome people. These outreach programs are normally funded out of the margins of your conference. Now, when you have floating costs, picking where your margin will end up can actually be quite difficult. If you give speakers complimentary tickets, you'll need to sell more tickets to cover the costs of bringing your speakers. You might get sponsorship that will offset some of that. But if your costs increase with the number of attendees, figuring out where in that gap your margin is going to be can be really, really difficult, much less for a new conference, because you don't have historical figures to inform what your budget is going to look like. This is what you'd actually prefer to have, predictable costs that don't change with the number of attendees you have, and revenue that doesn't change much with the number of attendees you have. If your budget looks like this, you'll know exactly how much money you have to spend, and you can figure out what to spend it on. North Bay Python's initial budget had no floating costs, which made things very predictable for us. So let's talk about how we managed to do that. So a conventional way to save money is to host your event in hotels in uninteresting locations. This reduces the cost of your venue hire. It might bring your catering costs down a bit too. Instead, we picked a venue right in the middle of downtown Petaluma, in the middle of a restaurant district with more than 50 places to eat, catering to lots of different budgets. We made our lunch breaks extra long and had people go and explore the downtown area and find things to eat and meet some people. By going downtown, we spent far more on our venue than we could have, but it meant that we didn't need to spend on catering. We traded our floating costs for a slight increase in fixed costs. Now, I'm generally on the record as saying that conferences need catering, But for an event of 200 to 300 people, as long as nearby food is plentiful, there's no need to cater. This might not work for a PyCon or something in a really remote location, but for an event of our size in the middle of a downtown, it worked just fine. And it turns out that catering is the biggest per attendee cost for any conference. Tickets need to cost as much as catering, so if you remove it entirely, your floating costs drop massively. Conveniently, it actually also improves inclusivity for people with dietary issues because they don't need to pay for food that they can't eat if we make a mistake. This was slightly bad for people who attended on financial aid because they needed to pay for lunch and we didn't reimburse that. That was unfortunate. We'll be fixing that this year. So with catering out of the way, we figured out what our absolute minimum event could look like built entirely out of fixed costs. So our minimum viable conference consisted of our venue, our projector and mics, the cost of bringing speakers to the conference because we wanted to have the best speakers, not the best speakers who could afford to come. Video recording because we wanted everybody to benefit from our material, not just people who could afford to come. And also our lanyards and badges, which even though they're per person, we ordered far enough in advance, they look like a fixed cost anyway. And all this cost about $20,000. And our $20,000 minimum viable conference had no per attendee costs at all. So why am I spending all this time on pulling costs out of your budget? What does this have to do with inclusivity and diversity? Well, you might remember that cost is a huge barrier to a number of people attending conferences. And we didn't need to charge for tickets. Sure, we charged a $25 nominal fee to make sure that people with money actually showed up. But we were in a position to waive that fee for anyone who asked us, and we could do so with absolute confidence that the conference would still break even. Those complimentary tickets cost us nothing, but it made the event considerably more accessible to more people. By making the conference affordable by default, we massively reduced the costs of doing outreach. So I'm going to finish up by talking about how we got that money to fund our minimum viable conference. We end up getting about $61,000 in revenue, with about $12,000 of that being ticket and t-shirt sales. The other $49,000 that we got came in sponsorship. Now, remembering that our minimum viable conference cost about $20,000, that meant that we only needed to bring in between about 4 and 10 individual transactions to put our conference on. And at $2,000, our sponsorships actually cost less than a ticket to numerous professional software development conferences, which makes it a fairly easy sell, but those amounts are still small enough that the conference wouldn't fail if the sponsorship didn't work out. And because we didn't have per head prices, we knew that we could run our conference by September, before a single person had bought a ticket. On the other hand, 25% of our attendees registered in the last 2 days before the conference. Relying on sponsorship gave us confidence to design the events that we want before we knew how many people were going to be there. And then once we paid for this minimum viable conference, we had the confidence to add more things to our budget. We focused on things that made the conference more inclusive and accessible, like live captioning, like travel assistance for people who needed more than just a free ticket, lunch guides that people could find food in this unfamiliar city. And to be responsible, we only added new items to the budget as we raised the money we needed for that item. So in summary, we minimized our floating costs substantially, and once we did that, we didn't need to focus on raising money through tickets. We focused on sponsorship. And once we had the conference that we wanted, we added items to the budget that directly helped improve inclusivity. Let's see if I can find the other slides again. How embarrassing. Right.
So that's it. 25 minutes of tips on how you can make your own events as inclusive as possible. We're going to finish with some parting thoughts.
So not every event has the same needs or the same audience as us. So if you do everything that we did in exactly the same way, you probably won't get the same results. You also don't need to do everything that we did.
Remember that we started planning this conference not more than 6 months before the first talks went on stage. And actually, a lot of it we decided on only 3 months before the event. That's a really tight time frame, and if you're less experienced running conferences than we are, by which I mean than Chris and Josh are, because this is the first time I did this, it might be difficult to replicate what we did.
But if you only do some of what we did, you'll still be better than most other events. because the bar is so low. If more conferences do just some of what we've done, we can raise that bar and make more inclusive places for people.
Finally, North Bay Python 2018, it's taking place later this year on the first weekend of November, once again in beautiful downtown Petaluma, California. Our CFP will probably open in the next month or so once we find some free time. You can find announcements on our Twitter feed at North Bay Python or by signing up for our email newsletter, which you can sign up for at northbaypython.org. If you want to sponsor or ask any other questions about the conference or the things we talked about today, you can find us outside immediately after this talk. Finishing off with some thanks, Andrew Godwin and Sarah, who are our other co-organizers, Software Freedom Conservancy, who acted as our legal entity for this conference, the Python Software Foundation, who gave us our very first sponsorship so that we could actually pay our venue deposit back in June, and everyone else who found themselves involved in our 2017 conference. So thank you all for coming, and hopefully we'll see some of you in Petaluma in November. Thank you.